Yeah.
It's hard to get off the ground though.
Yeah, you're telling me. Try jumping. Let's open in prayer. Fill join me, we'll begin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord,
and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call mine own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me.
Hey, welcome to episode 7.
Make it 125.
I wonder if I remember to cut this out of the video. We have 2 objectives today. You should be able to describe how slavery reshaped... Sorry, I'll start again. We have 2... Let me know when I can start, Jackson.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. You should be able to describe how slavery shaped the social and economic relations of the Old South. We should be able to explain how the South justified the practice of slaveholding. Let's begin with Roman numeral next. I think it's 16 in your book, even though it's 15 up there. Roman numeral next. And we'll talk about the Old South. The Old South, where cotton is king. They actually referred to it as King Cotton because it had so much value. It ruled the South, and it made the South rule the world. Slavery was the... Yeah, what do you got?
When did tobacco stop being the cash crop?
Kind of in episode 7 here. So slavery, as the peculiar institution of the South, did not die out. It was thought that if you stopped the international slave trade, and then you had things like the cotton gin taking off less demand, the slavery would just kind of work itself out as not being profitable anymore. It didn't die out. It grew to nearly 4 million slaves by 1861. Cotton replaced sugar as the world's major crop produced by slave labor. So sugar had been the most slave intensive. You'll remember, of course, that just the nature of growing sugar means that it takes so many more, like the slave to master ratio was so tricky. But cotton replaced sugar as the world's major crop produced by slave labor in the 19th century. The strength of American slavery rested on cotton. 3/4 of the world's cotton supply came from the southern United States. Cotton supplied textile mills around the world, both in the northern part of the United States, but also in Europe. And by 1803, Jimmy, here's the straight answer to your question. By 1803, cotton represented America's most important export. By 1860, which is outside of period 4, but to follow our storyline, by 1860, it was well over half of the total value of all exports of the country. So cotton became just crucial. It just became crucial. And it grows so well. This is actually still true today. America still grows a snot load of cotton. So I'm in the t-shirt business. Besides being a teacher, my wife and I have a t-shirt press. And make sure that shuts. Okay, so my wife and I have a t-shirt business, and I noticed one time, I was looking at the t-shirts I'm printing, and they're from, like, it says made in Honduras. And I look at that and I'm like, okay, made in Honduras. But I kind of started looking into it, and I just kind of nerded up on this for a little bit. The shirt was sewn together in Honduras, but it was made out of thread. And so, like, it was made out of cloth. The cloth was made in India by thread, which was made in, like, Vietnam, which was made with cotton grown in the United States. So by the time that I get that t-shirt in Kansas City, it has gone from the United States to Vietnam to India to Honduras, back to the United States, where I will put it on and realize that I'm too fat to wear that shirt, so I will take it to Goodwill, where they will either sell it secondhand or ship it off to sub-Saharan Africa to be worn by somebody there. That t-shirt is more well-traveled than any human being in this room. It's like, holy cow. All right.
How did you figure all that
And
out?
what's that?
How did you figure all that out? Where
It took a while. Yes. Okay. And what I also learned was that American cotton is like the greatest cotton in the world. The variety that grows in the United States has particularly good fibers, like they're just like long strands that make good thread, and it's the softest and strongest. So even though cotton itself can be grown in a lot of places, if your weather is hot and crappy and your soil is mediocre, you can grow cotton. But the variety that grows particularly well in the United States is particularly good. And so American cotton, even all these years into the 21st century, is still like one of our chief exports because it's just really good. We have good fiber that the rest of the world wants. I know, it's true. It's true. Okay, so subpoint B. Although the African slave trade was prohibited, even though oh wait. Are you ready?
Yeah.
You sure?
I'm just sad.
You need a minute? You need a minute?
I'm good.
I know you're good, but do you need a minute?
No,
I know you're good. You are ontologically good. You were created good. You created for the good.
I'm good.
Are you ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes,
Since we're like kind of still off track, am I doing the Angelus in here or am I going to the office?
you're going in the office. Okay. We're not off track. This is a track. Richard's important. He's a precious child of God. If he's not ready, then
This is the third one of these I've broken.
oh,
Kind of sad.
that's sad. How did it break?
Dropped all three of them. All three of them shattered.
Gravity, man. In the same place? It's the same break?
Two of them shattered in the lid, and the first one shattered in the bottom. Shattered.
Okay, so good news. You can take the lid of the first one.
Oh, I threw it away.
This story just keeps getting This is going to be the worst YouTube video ever. Okay, I'm sorry. Hey guys, Richard's having a hard day.
Okay.
Give him a high five. You'll see him today. Okay? Kind of cheer him up.
Oh no.
That's solidarity right there. Good. Okay, subpoint B. Although the African slave trade was prohibited, so like we hadn't been importing slaves for a long time, but even though the African slave trade was prohibited, the sale and trade of domestic slaves was still allowed. So like homegrown slaves was still allowed. And in every significant southern city, they contained the offices of slave traders and auction houses who would trade slaves. And basically, so even Kansas City, so Missouri was a slave state. Kansas City had slave auction houses to it. And there's actually, one of the most famous of them still exists today. You don't go to Westport, so you don't know where this is. But so like if there's such thing as a venerable bar, the most venerable bar in the city, Kelly's, was a slave auction house. And if you're in Westport, you look up on the second floor of Kelly's. They used to have it. I haven't been to Westport in a long time, but they used to have like silhouettes in the windows of people to represent that Kelly's, the building, was an auction house, and they were like the human beings were bought and sold in the warehouse today. So like the memory still haunts. Even Kansas City. We don't think of Kansas City as like slave country, but it was. Missouri was a slave state. So,
I'll give another trick or treater.
hello.
Of all the places in Kansas.
Hi.
Oh, who is it? Michelangelo. Is he Michelangelo?
Woo-hoo!
So you didn't go for the candy, you went for the globe.
Yeah, that's great.
No, James, stop.
That globe is older than every person in this room but me.
Really?
Yeah.
You're gonna break
Like
the
the
globe.
Soviet Union on it. It's
Nice.
not gonna break it.
You sure?
You say that?
It's how the world turns.
What are we learning today?
Yeah, they're correct.
We got a tough topic today. We're talking about the growth of slavery in the South. What's your costume? Yeah, it's good candy.
What do you
What's your
say?
costume?
What are you?
Tell him.
A flag? This is a flag.
I like your costume, buddy.
Michelangelo! Nice!
What do you say?
Oh, pound!
That's right.
Power.
Look.
Alright, come on.
It's good to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Here, give. parents deserve some candy too.
I'll be eating most of it.
The dad tax. It's great.
Did you ever see that on, was it Jimmy Kimmel? Like
Oh,
the video of like,
yeah.
I ate all my
It's sad. I
candy.
don't like watching that. Like, I'll just.
I'm definitely
just-
gonna be that mad.
No, you just gotta, you
You're
just
not
gotta be
gonna be
upfront
lying
with the
about
kids. The dad tax is 25% off the top. Dads get to pick first. 25. Jesus only asks for 10, but dad takes 25. I don't steal it, I just take it in front of them. It's like taxation is theft, Jimmy. Don't you read your Ayn Rand? Okay. Okay, so but how did slavery work? This is really going to be the worst YouTube video. Okay, most Southerners did not own slaves. Most Southerners did not own slaves. In fact, 3/4 of Southerners were not slave owners. Only a quarter did, and of those, most of them weren't plantation like huge estates. So like the Upper South. In the Upper South, which Virginia, Maryland. In the Upper South, slave owners made a pretty small population of the overall people. When you get down to the Deep South, there's more and more so. In the Lower South, the economic growth pattern was different. Take New Orleans. New Orleans, the only significant city. Where are we here? Did I miss a line?
We're 7.C, the Southern economy.
Manufactured
Yeah,
Did we get this? Is this the right line?
goods. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. That is weird. It's a different line on mine than it is on yours. It shouldn't be number 4. That should be little b. Should be little b, little b. Ba 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 ba.
Why? Wasn't that the beat to it?
Huh? All right. So there used to be a Sesame Street skit where they had. It wasn't the Beatles. They were like the Bugs, and they would sing a song. The letter B, letter B. Oh, you mean so much to me. Ba 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 ba. Letter B. That's a good one. Okay. The region produced. Okay, sorry. Let's come back to class. The Deep South produced less than 10% of all of the nation's manufactured goods, basically because slavery was so profitable. There was so much money to be made in cotton growth driven by slavery that Southerners were discouraged from doing anything else. Don't build any factories. Why? You're wasting your time and your capital by investing in something that isn't going to make you nearly as much money as just slavery will make you as much. Like cotton growth will make you as much money. Cotton is king. And so the South actually deliberately doesn't industrialize because there's too much money to be made in cotton production. Now it's worth noting that the North is also not immune to slavery. Because the North is the industrial heart, and because they produce things like textiles, they're buying Southern cotton. They're buying slave-picked, slave-produced crops. And they're buying it at a price that's low because you don't have to pay for the labor, right? The North is profiting off of slavery while they don't actually own the slaves. Also, as a sidebar, there were slaves in the North. The states that were phasing it out phased it out, and sometimes kind of slowly. There's actually Northern slaves all the way up until the time of the Civil War. And so, you see that people are profiting on this even if they don't directly participate in it. Roman numeral 17, probably, the planter class. In 1850, most slave-holding families owned 5 or fewer slaves, and fewer than 2,000 families in the entire country owned 100 slaves or more. So like very, very few people were major slave owners. But the proportion of the people doesn't talk about the size of the argument. Ownership of slaves provided the route to wealth, status, and influence. And planters really, like I said, discouraged their sons from entering manufacturing. The wealthiest people spent their money not on factories, but on the great plantation estates and elegant mansions. The pro-slavery argument. You remember John C. Calhoun? Remember I said he went like crazy hair later in life? This is it. I know. He looks like Kevin Bacon on a craze here. Okay. The pro-slavery argument rested on a number of pillars, including a commitment to white supremacy. People were making biblical arguments to justify slavery, and the historical precedent that slavery itself was essential to human progress, that all of the best nations and eras of the world used slaves to do that. And paternalism was also kind of caught up in it. The idea that, slave owners thought of themselves as doing a favor for the slaves. There was a sort of like, well, I'm a good slave owner. I take care of my slaves. They even kind of like being slaves. There was this sense of paternalism that became ingrained in slave society. It enabled slave owners to think of themselves as kind, even responsible masters, while they were still buying and selling human property. Yes?
So is the portrayal of like slave owners like just absolutely abusing their slaves accurate, or?
It's hard to say that with a straight, like a definitive answer across the board. Slaves were an investment in property, and most people don't try to abuse their investments. That said, we also know that it happens. I mean, there's a lot of stories people would own a horse and beat the crap out of the horse. So, yeah, I mean, I think every person is individual, so I don't have a straight answer for that. But it made it more justifiable if you were nice to slaves. So I don't know. There's not a straight answer to that. Yes, Christian.
Can I use the rest?
You may. John C. Calhoun. The reason that we have crazy-eyed John C. Calhoun, crazy-haired John C. Calhoun. The thing is, that's not an accident. He did that on purpose. And he does this before there are blow dryers.
Wow.
I know. I don't know how he did it. That's majestic. Really. It's majestic. John C. Calhoun, crazy-haired John C. Calhoun, even began to argue that things like the Declaration of Independence don't even really apply anymore. The idea of all men being created equal and endowed with liberty. John C. Calhoun said the Declaration of Independence is a product of its time. It's not universalizing. And even today, it may be dangerous if we try to circulate this rhetoric. Yeah, I mean, the Declaration of Independence is as close as you get to secular gospel in our country. It's our favorite thing. Yeah, Calhoun began to even argue that maybe this was dangerous rhetoric. Subpoint C. What's the rest of the world doing with slavery? Basically, they're getting out of the slave business. They're getting out of the slave business. You see, in North and South America, colonies, countries, they're just getting out of it. It's no longer feels like the state of the art. England outright banned slavery. There's this great story. You know the song Amazing Grace, perhaps the greatest of all the Christian hymns, was written by a guy who was a slave trader. He was a sailor on a slave ship that suddenly has a dramatic and very personal conversion to Christianity, and he realizes what he's doing is terribly wrong. And he says it's the amazing grace that saved him, the wretch, the sinner, the person that bought and sold other human beings. And he pens what is, for my money, the greatest hymn in the Christian tradition, was a reaction to this. And he, like a lot of people, were just refusing to participate. England gave up on slavery. Every major colony, every major country was giving up on slavery. But it also seemed like maybe this was the crazy thing. Abolition in the Americas influenced debates over in the United States. Pro-slavery advocates said, yeah, but look at those countries that are doing it. Their economies are tanking. If you get rid of slavery, then that's like you're going to ruin America, like they're ruining their countries. Abolitionists argue and say, yeah, while the economy suffers, we also see that living standards are going up. So because people aren't living in slave conditions anymore, they're living like human beings. So the overall standard of living is going up. And what are you measuring in an economy when you're actually talking about people? By mid-century, by mid-1800s, New World slavery remained only in 4 countries: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and the United States. We're the only 4 countries in the Western Hemisphere still practicing the practice. Practicing the practice. It's a weak way to do the notes. But that's what we got today. You have your composition books. You have a lot of choices to choose from.